Opening the king's flank so early sacrifices pawn structure for a fleeting initiative, potentially weakening your king's safety. Knight hops out, preparing to contest the center and shield its king from this aggressive Dutch opening. This knight development aims to bolster the center and prepare for kingside castling, but it neglects the vulnerable f-pawn. Preparing a fianchetto for the bishop creates a strong diagonal presence, potentially pressuring white's center. Solidifying the e4 square, d3 prepares a potential c4 push, building a flexible pawn structure while keeping king's safety in mind. Securing the central square with d5 aims to expand black's pawn presence and challenge white's already unusual f4 setup. Developing the knight to d2 secures the f-pawn and prepares a potential kingside pawn storm, but sacrifices some tempo in central control. Pushing the pawn advances the queenside initiative, seizing central territory and potentially cramping white's development. Disputing central space actively challenges black's pawn chain, aiming for pawn breaks. Liberating the d-file allows active counterplay, but relinquishes central pawn presence. Opening that b-file for your rook to potentially support a queenside advance is an interesting choice, though it does leave your pawn structure slightly more fragmented on the queenside than it was before. Consider how you'll use that newly opened diagonal to generate counterplay. This knight's journey to d5 introduces a powerful central outpost, challenging white's pawn structure while opening lines for black's other pieces. Unleashing the queen in this position creates an immediate, aggressive geometric threat, forcing black to dedicate valuable resources to king defense rather than developing piece harmony or challenging white's slightly awkward pawn structure. Developing the knight to a more central square, nc6 offers immediate defensive support for the pawn on d4, while preparing to challenge the white queen and potentially activate the king's bishop later on. Asserting central presence, this knight boldly occupies a forward outpost, disrupting black's pawn chain and creating immediate tactical possibilities on the queenside, while simultaneously reinforcing white's central pawn majority and preparing for potential kingside activity. Developing the bishop to g7 initiates a proactive defense, aiming to undermine white's centralized knight and simultaneously prepare for kingside castling into a more secure environment, transforming a potentially cramped position into one with active piece play. Clearing a path for the bishop, this knight repositioning aggressively probes the kingside while setting up a potential battery with the queen, all while subtly reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for further development. Sensing a tactical opportunity, black retreats the knight to a square where it eyes the queen and potentially supports a pawn advance, creating a subtle but significant shift in the pawn structure's dynamism. Escalating the queenside pressure, this repositioning seeks to exploit the potential weakness created by black's pawn structure, aiming to drive a wedge through their developing pieces and potentially isolate them. Opening the e-file now allows rapid development, but the queen's repositioning is a direct response to your knight's former central presence, demanding a careful eye on queenside coordination. Opening the f-file for the rook, this pawn thrust immediately creates a central pawn majority for white, potentially dominating the d-file and cramping black's position if black doesn't find a way to counter the aggressive advance. Reclaiming the pawn with the bishop immediately re-establishes material balance, yet it opens up an interesting diagonal for white's queen and a potential attacking pathway towards black's king. This recapture, while seemingly natural, creates a slight pawn structure imbalance for black, potentially offering white targets on the e-file or the queenside later. The bishop's repositioning to e5 presents a direct threat, forcing white to react and potentially disrupting their nascent queenside pressure. From a geometric standpoint, this bishop's arrival on the e5 square creates a new set of potential lines of attack and defense that were previously absent. One might consider the long-term positional ramifications. Is this bishop now more active and better placed, or has it merely swapped one outpost for another, potentially exposed, square? The initiative is contested. This move grabs attention by challenging white's central pawn majority and centralizing a key piece. Think about the coordination of black's pieces now. The bishop on e5 and the knight on b6 create a formidable central presence. Exploiting the pinned knight's compromised square, this forcing check aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain tempo, potentially leading to a swift material advantage by capturing the d4 pawn. Recapturing with the knight to d7 strategically reestablishes a defensive presence, eyeing the c5 square and aiming to untangle the piece from its previous passive placement, while subtly preparing to contest the queen's current dominance on the queen side. Unleashing a bishop attack, white aims to exploit the slightly exposed black king by creating attacking possibilities along the h6-c1 diagonal, potentially setting up a future kingside assault. Confronting the bishop's assertive pressure on the long diagonal, this pawn push directly challenges the advanced white queen and aims to disrupt white's attacking coordination, all while reinforcing the central control and preparing to potentially shelter the king. Reasserting control over the central squares, this maneuver simultaneously prepares for a potential pawn push and discourages further encroachment by black's knights, creating a subtle but important tension that demands careful attention from the opponent. Black recentralizes the knight, preparing to contest the d-file and offer peace exchanges, a sensible reaction to white's attempt to cramp the position with the queen and bishop. A bold bid to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines, though it invites immediate counterplay and potentially weakens white's own kingside light squares. Challenging the advanced bishop with the rook, black initiates a dangerous game of positional brinkmanship, daring white to miscalculate the resulting pawn structure and potential skirmishes along the now-open g-file. Shattering the defensive shield around black's king, this capture immediately clarifies the board's central structure, opening a direct assault line and forcing black to react to a dramatically altered pawn formation. A pivotal moment. Black embraces the doubled pawns, opening a direct diagonal for the rook, but at the cost of structural integrity and potentially exposing the king to future onslaughts, especially with white's pieces poised to exploit the weakened dark squares. Unlocking the d-file presents a compelling avenue, potentially opening lines towards black's castled king and creating immediate pressure on the queen side. Black seizes the initiative, kicking the knight and immediately challenging the center, aiming to disrupt white's newly established pawn chain. The knight embarks on a surprising journey, shifting its focus from the kingside to potentially control the d4 square and perhaps reroute to c4 or e4 later on, aiming to alleviate the queenside pressure and find a new strategic outpost. Unyieldingly pushing forward, black sacrifices pawn structure for a potentially dynamic setup, aiming to disrupt white's kingside influence and exploit the awkward placement of the knight. Exploiting the exposed kingside, white opens a diagonal for their bishop and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, potentially creating long-term weaknesses. Seizing the initiative on the e-file opens up exciting possibilities for black, directly challenging white's central pawn structure and forcing a reckoning for the newly liberated dark-squared bishop. Aha, black's king suddenly looks quite exposed, with that pawn storm on the kingside now seemingly stalled and white's pieces beginning to swarm around the weakened defenses. The bishop now eyes that crucial dark square diagonal, aiming to pry open lines toward the monarch. The rook's retreat to the 7th rank initiates a daring plan to contest the open f-file, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay against the king. Securing the monarch initiates a crucial phase, transforming the battlefield from mere squares to a battleground for king safety and potential offensive maneuvers. The rook's advanced position on the 7th rank, coupled with the d4 pawn, creates a fascinating dynamic, potentially opening lines for rapid counterplay. Opening a vital diagonal for the queen and challenging the pawn chain's integrity, this aggressive knight sacrifice promises to unravel black's kingside defenses and potentially expose the weakened monarch. Sacrificing the pawn opens up critical lines and offers a chance to activate the bishop, though it does leave the king's defenses somewhat permeable for the moment. The intent here is likely to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the queen side, as white's central control might waver. reclaiming material while simultaneously creating a potent battery on the c-file. This capture forces black to confront a significant positional imbalance and potential for immediate tactical threats on the kingside. Poking the dragon's eye, this audacious knight's sortie forces a positional concession and opens avenues for a daring kingside invasion. Safeguarding the monarch from that pesky bishop attack, the king retreats to a slightly more sheltered square, preserving its immediate safety while indirectly preparing for potential counterplay. The bishop now ventures out, disrupting white's pawn chain and eyeing that potentially exposed kingside. Unleashing a queen sacrifice disguised as a tactical shot, white capitalizes on the exposed black monarch, forcing a response that will either lead to immediate material gain or a surprisingly open position for white's remaining forces. The black king, now exposed by the pawn advance, desperately seeks refuge, but the open files and white's unleashed bishop pose immediate threats that a simple retreat cannot fully neutralize. The focus shifts from material to king's safety and preventing further white incursions before any substantial counterplay can be organized. The knight, a misplaced hero, now finds its rightful place, a potent spearhead aimed directly at black's exposed king, and a looming threat against the weak f7 pawn, while simultaneously bolstering the central pawn structure. Shifting the rook to the open b-file is a prudent attempt to activate a dormant piece, potentially disrupting white's developing pressure and offering a lifeline for counterplay on the queen side. Reclaiming the center and initiating a dangerous pin on the knight, this maneuver forces black to confront the immediate threat of a discovered attack on their rook, dictating their defensive choices and potentially unraveling their pawn structure. Unpinning the queen from that pesky e3 bishop, while simultaneously challenging the white queen and opening a diagonal for the dark-squared bishop, this maneuver aims to consolidate black's position and prepare for potential counterplay. Unleashing a positional squeeze, this maneuver aims to restrict black's development and exploit the weaknesses created on the kingside by the pawn structure. Releasing the pinned bishop and opening a diagonal for potential queenside counterplay, a bold but perhaps premature freeing maneuver given the king's somewhat exposed situation. Reinforcing the central e-file and preparing to potentially activate the rook against black's somewhat exposed king position. Recognizing the immediate danger, black prioritizes shielding their vulnerable king from the lurking white bishop and queen, opting for a defensive posture that consolidates the pawn structure and prepares for potential counterplay. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm, white attempts to pry open the defenses around black's monarch, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares left by the exchange of bishops. Disengaging the bishop from its attacking post on g5 to f6 seems like a tactical concession, opening a path for white's rook to potentially infiltrate on the e-file. But perhaps black sees an opportunity to reorganize and solidify their pawn structure while preparing for a future defense of the king. Sharpening the attack, this maneuver redirects the queen to a more active diagonal, eyeing the potentially exposed black king and preparing to exploit the open files that have emerged. The pawn advance on the f-file, while seemingly aggressive early on, has created a permanent weakness that the bishop on e7 now effectively covers, aiming to neutralize the long-range threat of white's queen. Unleashing the pawn storm, this capture rips open the king's defenses, potentially creating long-term weaknesses for black even if the immediate consequences are contained. Snatching that pawn feels like a desperate attempt to inject some life into a position that's already teetering, and the immediate consequence is opening up that d-file for white's rook, potentially leading to a swift demise for your king. Confronting the central queen forces an exchange that will dramatically simplify the board, stripping away much of the existing complexity, and ushering in an endgame where the remaining pawns and minor pieces will shoulder the full burden of the strategic struggle. The bishop now stands poised to control the light squares, a valuable asset given white's exposed king and the open nature of the position. White's pawn storm has stalled, but here, the advancing f-pawn seeks to pry open lines towards black's beleaguered king. The goal is to create a passed pawn or at least disrupt black's defensive structure, turning the game into a sharp tactical slugfest. This maneuver deliberately introduces complexity, potentially catching an unprepared opponent off guard. The defender must now embrace a defensive posture, seeking to consolidate their remaining material around the exposed monarch. Unlocking the c-file for its rooks now becomes paramount, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and its compromised pawn structure on the kingside, potentially leading to a decisive material advantage or a mating attack if black isn't careful with piece placement. Creating a new stronghold on g5 for the pawn, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's central pawn chain and potentially open lines for black's remaining pieces. Clearing the path allows your pawn majority to advance, potentially creating a passed pawn that will demand black's immediate attention. Bishops often find themselves in awkward spots, and yours has retreated to a defensive posture, aiming to regroup and perhaps contest the crucial central squares, though it currently lacks immediate attacking potential. Opening the h-file now presents an immediate, aggressive avenue for the monarch's swift demise, threatening to split open the defensive structure. A desperate attempt to awaken the dormant g-file, hoping to exploit any lingering disarray in white's king's flank, and perhaps even generate a mating threat by unearthing the black king's previous safe harbor. Opening the central files now offers a clear path to exploiting black's exposed monarch, with the d-pawn poised to become a formidable attacking instrument. A bold gambit to unchain the rook, aiming to pry open lines and disrupt white's central control, though it invites a dangerous pawn storm on the kingside. Unlocking the h-file is a desperate, but perhaps necessary gambit to inject life into the attack, seeking to exploit the potential mating net around the black king now that the pawn structure is so fractured. Regaining the bishop on g5 reestablishes a crucial defensive piece, though the unleashed central pawns now present a serious pawn storm threat that requires careful navigation. Pushing that pawn forward to its 6th rank is a bold maneuver, aiming to disrupt black's pawn chain and create a passed pawn that's a constant thorn in the opponent's side. It forces a difficult decision for black: either block with the knight, potentially sacrificing it for insufficient compensation, or allow white's pawn to advance further, dominating the d-file and threatening to penetrate deep into the enemy camp. This move injects dynamism into what might otherwise become a static position, demanding black's immediate attention and potentially opening lines for white's remaining pieces. Unleashing the rook along the open file is a strategic imperative, aiming to exploit the newly cleared path towards white's vulnerable king and potentially pressure any remaining weak pawns or pieces. The queen's departure from the queenside initiates a fascinating endgame transition where pawn structure will likely dominate, and the active rook now faces the daunting task of coordinating with its remaining pawns against a centralized bishop. Finally, the bishop recaptures the rook, ending a whirlwind of exchanges that has drastically simplified the position. The immediate threat of the white d-pawn is neutralized, but the material imbalance remains stark, setting the stage for a challenging endgame where white's pawn majority on the queenside and central passed pawn will be formidable. The pawn on d7 initiates a decisive march, threatening to become an unstoppable queen and severing the last remaining defensive ties for black's rook. Initiating the recapture of the pawn on c5, black aims to alleviate immediate pressure and gain some breathing room, though this action doesn't fundamentally alter white's commanding pawn structure and clear lines of attack. The rook's forceful thrust to the 8th rank shatters black's defensive formation, exposing their king to a devastating onslaught and initiating a decisive attack through the open file. Seeking refuge for the beleaguered monarch, black brings the king to the 7th rank, a desperate gambit to escape the immediate mating net forming on the back rank and the encroaching rook. This maneuver, while momentarily warding off the direct attack, exposes the king to potential harassment from the white queen and rook on the open file, potentially leading to a swift collapse. The promotion creates an immediate, overwhelming material advantage, fundamentally altering the game's trajectory by introducing a powerful new queen to the board. Embracing the inevitable queen promotion, black surrenders the bishop in a final attempt to disrupt white's advancing pawns, setting the stage for a stark material imbalance. The rook gracefully relocates, seizing the seventh rank and establishing a formidable outpost that will dominate the center for the remainder of the contest. A final, desperate attempt to enliven the proceedings, aiming to sweep the pieces off the board and perhaps force a stalemate, though the material deficit makes this a near-impossible dream. The king's journey to a safer square, a necessary pilgrimage after the surrounding chaos, finally begins its descent. Swinging the rook back to the second rank creates a significant threat, forcing the white king into a potentially precarious position and aiming to disrupt white's control of the open files. The monarch's repositioning to g3 aims to escape the immediate checks and offers a safer haven, anticipating further skirmishes as black's rook continues its hunt along the second rank. Snagging that rook is a tempting offer, but it surrenders the crucial passed pawn and allows the white king to join the action decisively.